We're starting off with land acknowledgement. Who are we as Anakbayan? PSR, just a brief history of the Philippines, and we have the guest speakers. So for land acknowledgement in today's fight of land rights to our ancestors and indigenous people against imperialism, Anakbayan Montreal recognized that we are hosting this campaign, albeit online, known on unceded land, Jojihage, Turtle Island, colonially known as Montreal. Ganyan Gihaga Nation is the custodian of the land and water where we are guests. Today, along with our two guests, for the moment only one guest, from the other side of the world, we'll want to use our platform to support the persistent resistance of indigenous Canadians against imperialism, colonialism rooted in capitalism. So who is Anakbayan? Mabuhay. Welcome to our first part of our third three-part series campaign for Defend Cordillera. Who are we? Anakbayan is a national democratic mass organization of youth aimed to make you all active, organized, and mobilized. How do we do that exactly? We're doing it right now. We organize, mobilize, and aim to educate you all about our fight for the Philippines' authentic liberation without any foreign intervention. So, USA, get out. China, get out. We, the Anaks or the youths, organize and mobilize the youth, workers, students, and young professional migrants, and you get the gist. Those who are vulnerable and oppressed against imperialism, fighting for that. With all this political instability, I know you all feel strongly against something, that you want to do something because it's not good. You have an urge, something needs to be done. So you mobilize, you organize, and you can start with us. So join us. So without further ado, that's just a little bit of picture of us and our solidarity. This is from the Workers' Day, May 1st, our solidarity with the Rally for Palestine, Free Palestine, Mother's Day, martial law in Park Mackenzie, where Rizal Park, which is the Philippines' national hero. Red tagging, for our campaign of red tagging. So as you can see, same way as in Colombia, same way in Palestine as well, the journalists, anyone who is defending for Palestine are now being incarcerated. So we also have red tagging. This is a legal term for tagging people because they deem to be terrorists, but we're just fighting for people's rights. And then we also met with Youth Palestine movements in Park Mackenzie, just talk about our plans with our organizing and had a little bit of picnic, Montreal vibes. So yeah. So briefly, this is just what we're going to talk about in terms of Philippine society revolution. Talk about the land, we talk about their resources, and of course, we talk about the Cordillera. So what is imperialism? Just first off, before we go even further, imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. In the next slide, we'll talk about why imperialist nations go to all of the struggle, sailing all the way to the other side of the world, to the island of the Philippines, material wealth, right? It's a thirst of wealth. Arriving in the Philippines, they see the indigenous peoples with gold accessories, gold chains, gold teeth, they want a piece of that. That's what they do. No regard for people who were already living in the land. They bring in their big guns and bully people to do trade with them. Trade with us with random things that we don't really need, and then they take our gold. This is just one example. I hope that Canadians out there also see the parallel between fur traders here, the indigenous people here, and the French colonizers. Anyway, these imperialist nations believe for indigenous people to be stupid for not profiting off their land, for not extracting the natural resources. They see indigenous people as primitive and clueless who does not even follow God. Now, it's still me, okay. Okay, so land, we now talk about the land, right? I know y'all are laughing. It's good to laugh. It's good to laugh. Good morning to everyone. So we go with land. The Philippine archipelago has at least about 7,100, give or take. With climate change, we don't know. No one cares about coastal cities or countries. But we have roughly 7,000. This is just how the Philippines look like, because people don't know where the Philippines is. Oh, what the hell is Philippine? Are you Filipinese? Don't know, right? I've got all of that. Yes, the Pearl of the Orient is perfectly situated in a shipping route. Remember when the Suez Canal was blocked and your orders were delayed? Imagine if that were to happen in the Philippine Maritime Territory. So as you can see in here, it's 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping. So most of the shipping also passed by in this area, which is now being disputed among other countries in this area. But already China has built their naval military force in here, so they have hard power. It is also, yeah, it is a strategic military location. As you can see in this area, this is American imperialist nation's sphere of influence in the East Asia, because China is here and this is the East and they want to fight them, and then they're the West, and you get the gist. Yeah, it is a shipping route. And then again, there's this conflict between who owns who. China is already posting their dominance over in the East Asia and like really growing towards the West. So that's why everyone is feeling a little bit nervous. When China started building their naval military force in here, Fisher Fork in all sides are having trouble continuing their livelihood. A lot of nations in this area did try to condemn China's action, but of course, are we not surprised that the Philippine president did not say anything, right? Which leads us to question, what's up with all of this imperialist nation coming all the way to the other side of the world to occupy Palestine Silananan? I will hand it out to my co-educator, Romel, who will be speaking about our natural resources and our human resources. So it's for you.
Thanks.
No.
Thanks, Vero. So on the next slide, we can see the natural resources. Okay. So I would start by saying that the Philippines is rich, but the people are poor, which basically means that the country is rich in natural resources, so minerals. We have fertile land for agriculture, lumber, food, etc. Yet the majority of its inhabitants remain entrenched in poverty. So why? And the simplest answer would be because the government has a foothold on them. So instead of having the people benefit from it, the government takes the resources and sells them for profit, all the while the people struggle. A fine example would be the gold mineral extraction operations in the Cordillera region being conducted by foreign contractors with permission by the Philippine government, while the inhabitants of that region, the Cordillerans, are persecuted for exercising their right to be there and make a living on the land. And speaking of gold, gold was actually a commodity in various Philippine societies, i.e. the noble Maharlika classes, the Datus, and the free folk, prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. And when the foreigners came and saw, they wanted to covet these riches. So under the guise of spreading Christianity, they used the sword to subjugate the locals, which in reality is a way to access these riches. And it's not just the gold, but other natural and mineral resources as well, including labor and transportation of the goods back to Spain. So when Spain was overthrown, the US was quick to replace them. And under American colonization, the US was able to extract more resources, you can say even double, and in less time compared to Spain. And this was in part to infighting amongst Filipinos who, after almost 400 years of colonial rule, are left to build a nation while trying to piece back whatever is left of their culture. Because Filipinos before, they weren't really Filipinos. It was like a blanket statement. And then they realized that their common denominator is the struggle, but culturally they're still different. Tagalogs are different from Ilocanos is different from Bicolanos, and from Visayas, and so forth and so on. Now, when the war in the Pacific broke out, and Japan came to the Philippines, while still on the Philippines under US colonial rule, they wasted no time in siphoning the rich mineral resources that lay beneath the country. And after all that was finished and the foreigners have left, the cycle continued. So the rich and the powerful Filipino families, along with the Philippine government, decided to continue the trend, which led us to all that to say, which led us to that statement: the Philippines remain rich, but the people are still poor. So, having said that, for resources, aside from gold, due to our tropical weather and fertile soil, we also grow a variety of fruits, mangoes, Philippine mangoes, shameless plug, one of the best, vegetables, and other crops, i.e., we're a big exporter of rice. Like a huge portion of the rice that we harvest in the Philippines actually goes to China. Um, all that to say, yet during the pandemic, with many people having lost their livelihood, everyone is struggling and starving. The Duterte administration repeatedly claimed that it's because the Philippines is poor and that there's not enough ayuda, which is like a care package to provide for the citizens of the country. But as I've mentioned, the Philippines is not poorly managed, I would say. So in response to this, the power of the people, the locals organized um, the Maginhawa Community Pantry, as you can see on the slide, which is a mass-led initiative to feed Filipino families from hunger. And we can do this because we're rich in resources. We have it. It's just in the right hands, we can feed the entire nation. But again, to circle back, we instead export them to imperialist neoliberal countries for capital instead of investing it in our community. So that to say, not only we export tropical produces and minerals, we also export labor, as I kind of mentioned earlier. On the next slide, please. Labor export. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess we go back. So with the labor export, basically it's a form of, it's an export, but it's also tied to land mass immigration. Because when people are displaced out of their homes, they flee elsewhere. But moving and settling is costly. And in this arduous process, they need to sustain themselves. And this is not to live comfortably, but it's to survive. And under capitalism, everything we need is commodified. So those who flee must find work to support their families and afford to live. So where do they go? Usually, people that are displaced in the Philippines they're from the rural areas and they would move to the city. But since cities like Manila, or if you're in the Visayan region, Cebu or Davao, it's already overpopulated, and the prices skyrocketing unemployment rates, on top of it being costly, isn't very optimal as to relocate. And if you have a big family, which is normally the case, so what they would do is they would migrate somewhere else, and that would be outside of the country. But since immigrating to a developed country like the US or Canada is normally a bureaucratic and painstakingly long procedure, plus the amount of money you need to show before you get granted permission to enter and settle, a lot of Filipinos who have to do this don't have that luxury. Plus, if you have a family with many mouths to feed, it's even harder. So this is where labor export comes from. Instead, the parent or both decides to work as an overseas Filipino worker, which is also known as OFW, to provide for their family. Now, because the Philippine currency is weak, industrialized imperial nations like the US, Canada, us including, the EU, China, Dubai, etc., which the Philippines have somewhat a labor contract with, so to speak, get to take advantage of this conversion difference. So once the OFW have gone and through this process and they are now working and earning their salaries abroad, um, they send that money that they've earned, for the most part, almost everything, back home. And in that process, the Philippine government, sorry, makes money off the backs of these laborers through remittances. So the simplest way to do it is the government gets a cut every time, and the cut is big. So, and at the end of the day, it's a win-win situations for the Philippine government and industrialized imperialist nations, including Canada, because they profit from it, and the people suffer through this labor exploitation. And just to, because I was saying Canada, because Canada is the one main source of caregivers here where we are actually from the Philippines, and 90% of the applicants that are into this caregiver program originate from the Philippines. And just in last year, 2020, during the pandemic, um, at least half of the Filipino Canadian diaspora lost or have their wages slashed. But with this labor export and the remittances, and knowing the Filipinos' desire to help their families back home, they would still send the money back. So all in all, in summation, that's like a total of, millions or even billions of dollars that the Canadian government have made and the Philippine government have made off the backs of laboring Filipinos. So going to the next slide. So that ties in with this imperialism with what's happening in the Cordillera region. Because as I mentioned earlier, the siphoning of natural resources from the gold and rice and all that fertile soil and arable land. So that to say is talk about the land rights of the people from the Cordillera region. So just to say that the indigenous people who are displaced in these lands because of the government trying to take it, is considered state property. So the indigenous lands, the Cordillera region, the Philippines, are considered state property, meaning indigenous peoples basically have no right over their own lands where generations of their family have lived. So now they are displaced. On top of that, there's a huge paramilitary presence in the region. So displacement in the name of progress and profit and protecting interest from the Canadian government. So these military presence are a combination of the Philippine Armed Forces of the Philippines, military police, backed by imperialist nations like U.S. and so-called allies, because they're there to protect these foreign mining company operations that are like Canada, the Canadian, Australian Canadian company, Oceana Gold. That is, we've been very vocal in petitioning about. So that's where I'm at. So just a few weeks ago, our allies, ICHRP, have spoken out to Canadian Parliament, calling out Canada's complicity in human rights abuses and destruction of our land. And why? Well, because the mining operations are Canadian-owned, as I've mentioned, and they had investors who put money for the extraction of our resources for their own benefit. And all this to say basically leads to the third point in the slide, which is erasure of culture. So, which means that people who are indigenous to the lands are displaced, and they had to move elsewhere because their lands were generation of their families were destroyed and successfully resisted against colonial powers, the Spanish, the British, the Americans, the Japanese, and now the Philippine government. And on top of that, their land has been taken, their water is contaminated because of these mining operations, and land can no longer sustain and grow food for the people. So when all that happens, people have to leave. They lose their ties to the land. It's similar to, like when indigenous peoples here in Canada have been driven out of their land. They lose their ties to the land. They lose their ties to the community. They lose their ties to their culture, to their ancestry. So you have like this the future people that lose their ties to their indigenous past. So that is a struggle, not just in the struggle of the people in the Cordillera. It's a struggle of indigenous people all over the world, here in Canada, in South America, all over the world. So that's about it. So I'm gonna loop it back to Vero again. So
Oh, okay. Thank you for the whole very brief history of the Philippines. I hope that it's digestible enough for everyone. Thank you for Ramel for making it more concise. If I speak, it will be much more than that and will take days. Thank you. We are waiting for our next speakers, but I was told that she's on her way. Do we give a little bit of break for everyone? How is everyone feeling right now? Everyone's still feeling asleep? I'm feeling asleep a little bit. But if not, we can move forward with our second speaker for the moment, if Rana doesn't mind speaking. Yes. Yeah. So let me just represent you, Rana. Thank you so much. Doing a little bit of parallel with the indigenous struggles, and always been resisting against imperials, like Spanish, British, American, and Japanese imperials. The Igorot, the Cordillera region, which is in the mountain, they have always been resisting. So I want to make a little bit of parallel of how the Palestinian has always been resisting to defend their land. So Rana Nazal Hamade is a Palestinian Canadian artist, activist, community organizer, both in the Turtle Island as well as her homeland, Palestine. With her MFA in documentary media and bachelor's in human rights, she is right now on the ground in Palestine, bravely bringing awareness of the brazen ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Rana, thank you so much for being here with us. I will mute myself now.
Thank you so much for having me. Just give me a sign if my internet starts to cut at any point, and I'll go on to data because my Wi-Fi is a bit unreliable. Yeah, so like Veronica said, I'm an artist, I'm an activist, I'm an abolitionist, anti-imperialist, and what I mean by that is that I believe that our struggles can only be won through an entire upheaval of the global systems of power that exists right now. And I guess I'm saying this kind of in contrast to reformists or folks who can believe that we could just shift a few policies and make the violence that we're seeing in front of us a little bit better. I think we have to look at how all of the power, all the systems of power globally are deeply connected. And so even though we don't use the language of abolition very much in Palestine, our struggle is an abolitionist one, because in Palestine, it would, when we talk, for example, about the thousands of political prisoners in Israeli jails, nobody's pushing for policies of better policing. I don't know. I'm trying to remember what reformists push for, but I mean, nobody can be confused about the fact that every Palestinian prisoner in Israeli prisons is a political prisoner, and that the only thing that would lead to their freedom is the fall of the Israeli settler apartheid regime. And so in that way, it's a very abolitionist struggle. And I think we also can understand that until US imperialism is brought down, there will be no Black liberation or indigenous liberation in Turtle Island, just as there will be no liberation for our people in Palestine or in the Philippines or in the rest of the world. And I think this is the importance of our struggle as an international one, and the importance of us connecting transnationally, because even though the conditions and the experiences that we have are very different, the forces that make our oppression possible are very tightly linked, and they support one another. So I wanted to talk first broadly about land rights, and then kind of go more specifically into what's been happening this month. So, I mean, many people know or don't know that Palestinian life is traditionally very tied to the land's gifts, our health, our stories, our histories. Every tradition is very historically rooted to the land. And settler colonialism has worked tirelessly to sever this relationship between indigenous people and the land. And in part, this is displacement, imprisonment, eradicating them from the land in order to take the land and to profit and extract from it. The very unique, I mean, it's not unique, but the way that Zionist settler colonialism defines itself, its goal is to eradicate Palestinians or non-Jewish Palestinians from the land of Palestine so that they can establish a Jewish ethno-religious supremacist state, which they have in part. So today we also, as Palestinians, I'm in the West Bank right now, we have another layer where since the 90s, we've had the Palestinian National Authority, which has an abhorrent policy of security coordination with Israel. And the PNA, has a donor-driven development model, and it has very strong neoliberal policies. And one of the ways that we see their policies play out is in relation to land, and there's a policy of official neglect of the agricultural sector. So you could look just at how PA funding works, and less than 1% of the PA's funding, PA's budget, is allocated to the agricultural sector, which is wild for a country living under settler colonialism, where Israel is every day trying to annex more and more land. And 85% of that 1% is just salaries. So there's absolutely no funding going to support farmers, to support anyone who's trying to work with the land. Because of so many other things, so many of the other neoliberal policies over the last 20 years, I don't have the stats in front of me, but there's been an enormous shift from people working on the land to people working in the cities in sectors like communications, which is what I do. But you could also look, so I said 1% is in the agricultural sector. Annually, it's about 30% is given to the security sector, so to policing. And we have an incredibly high amount of police per capita in the West Bank. And, I can say from experience that when we are marching in Ramallah, and we're marching towards the first point of contact with the Israeli state, where there will be an Israeli military base, we very often have to walk through a line of Palestinian Authority riot police on our way there. So there's an extreme collusion between the Palestinian Authority neoliberal pseudo government that we have and the Israeli settler colonial state, unfortunately. But I'll say that in parallel with the spread of colonialism, Palestinians, like indigenous peoples everywhere, have just continued to resist in ever evolving ways their own erasure and their erasure of the ecosystems, the languages, the traditions, the knowledges that have sustained our relationship on these lands for thousands of years before European colonialism. Something that's also interesting about Israel is that at the same time that Israel works to physically cleanse us from our lands and extracts from the lands so-called resources to fund its colonial expansion, it works really hard to brand itself as an eco-friendly haven. In 2006, especially, Israel, the foreign ministry actually launched this campaign called Brand Israel. And it was in response to the growth of anti-war movements around the world. And the goal of Brand Israel was to rebrand Israel as, and this is a direct quote, relevant and modern instead of militaristic and religious. So by 2010, the campaign was allotted over $26 million in state funding. And one facet of that was greenwashing. So it's very similar to other traditions that Brand Israel took on, like pinkwashing, or just general whitewashing of crimes. In greenwashing, Israel seeks to be perceived as eco-friendly and to present itself as liberal and progressive in relationship to us Palestinians who are violent, militaristic, religious, and certainly incapable of having developed an eco-friendly policy, which is the ultimate subtext. Greenwashing is one of the rhetorics that gives Israel access to the realm of the liberal democratic West. It also masks the state's actual record of environmental exploitation, and it reinforces Israel as part of the so-called modern world, like the US, Europe, much of the global north. And the reality for us is one of degradation of the land, depletion, pollution of water resources, deforestation, desertification. It's really a long-term ecocide. And we have to understand that ecocide and genocide are functioning together as part of one process that aims to, over time, eradicate Palestinians and exploit the land for profit. Now, here over the last month, so it's really been an incredibly historic month. And I think we're, as Palestinians, really dealing with all of the, there has been a historic uprising that most people my age have not seen, my age and younger. And then at the same time, we've seen just tremendous losses. And I think a lot of people are trying to go forward carrying both of those feelings. I'll start with talking about Sheikh Jarrah, because I think it was the movement that was coming out of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem may have been the impetus for everything that happened the rest of the month. Sheikh Jarrah is in East Jerusalem, which is under international law, Palestine's capital city, even though most Palestinians can't visit Jerusalem, like myself. And for the 28 families that live in Sheikh Jarrah, they have been facing a very rapid ethnic cleansing. I think it began actually in early 2002, but every few years they do some mass forced expulsions from people's homes. And that's what's happening this month. There's 28 families right now that are slated for expulsion from their homes. And what's literally happened in front of us is Israeli settlers, American Israeli settlers, have broken into people's homes and they've moved in. And once they move in, the Israeli army appears and defends them in the home that they've broken into. And then the Israeli settlers take the Palestinians who live in those homes to court. And then the courts uphold the Israeli settlers' residency and order the Palestinians to pay rent or get out. It's exactly what happened in 2008 and 9. And we're seeing it now right here. And in another neighborhood of East Jerusalem called Silwan, we're also seeing 700 individuals slated for expulsion from their homes. And this is all part of the Judaization of Jerusalem. Jerusalem symbolically is incredibly important to Israel's settler vision of itself. And the presence of Palestinians or non-Jews in Jerusalem is seen as a demographic threat to the settler state. So they have been working very hard to cleanse them from the city. And most of the time, in slow ways, this happens through just regular policies. Palestinians from Jerusalem are not given permits to build. They can't buy land, they can't buy homes. If they live outside of Jerusalem, they can lose their Jerusalem residency if they leave for more than 3 weeks, I think it is. So you can imagine how difficult it is for someone to keep and hold on to that residency even. And the reason that this story moved all of Palestine is because most of us have lived it. It's a very historic story. Most Palestinians lived it in 1948 when our ancestors were kicked out of their homes. My father was 7 years old in 1948 when Israel was created. So for him, it's not even an ancestral story. In 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes. And most of them have never been able to return, like my father. As we saw, the Sheikh Jarrah movement really picking up support across historic Palestine, we also begin to see Israeli settlers putting out, what's it called? They were putting out calls for attacks on Palestinians. We saw like tens of thousands of Israeli settlers marching through streets saying death to Arabs. We saw Palestinian homes across historic Palestine being marked as Arab homes so that they would be slated for attacks later. We saw like just, what's that word? We saw groups of Israeli settler mobs creating like fake checkpoints where they would stop cars, investigate if the person inside the car was Jewish or Palestinian. And if it was Palestinian, they would be attacking. I mean, we saw multiple people lynched or killed when they were going to work or walking in the streets. The actual call from one of the settler organizations was like said, literally, if you're seeing an Arab in the street, it's your duty to knife them. And so we saw also like marches with people holding knives up and things like that. Here in the West Bank, we saw, I mean, we live with settlers in the West Bank. We live with hundreds of Israeli settlements. But sometimes the lines are not as defined as people think because we're in a very active state of settler colonialism. Like when I was in my town for Eid, we were getting WhatsApp messages from people saying that Israeli settlers are disguised as Palestinians and walking through the city and you should be careful. Because Israeli settlers are often armed with actual guns and sometimes with other things like knives and whatever. And historically, it's almost impossible for a Palestinian to even bring a complaint against an Israeli settler to an indictment, even to level charges. Most complaints, something in the 95%, get ignored completely. And so often Palestinians don't even file complaints because who would they file them with? With the Israeli state. Again, the Israeli settler mobs were nothing new. I mean, settler mobs were one of the ways that Israel was able to colonize in 1948 and to expand and occupy the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. Israel relies a lot on what is seen as non-state actors that are actually state actors. And that's how settlers often function. And then, of course, this month we saw a very deadly attack on Gaza that killed over 250 Palestinians, over 65 children. And what we were hearing from our friends in Gaza was that the weapons felt very different, that there was new technology being used. The sounds, the gases, the smells, everything was different. And even while Gaza was being attacked, Israel announced its next weapons convention. And you have to really think of how Gaza is used by Israel to as a playground for experimenting the weapons that it's about to go out into the world and sell to countries like the Philippines to repress people's movements. We saw in Gaza this month entire homes targeted, entire families taken from the planet, entire families wiped off of the civil registry. We saw Gaza's top doctors and surgeons, them and their entire families killed. Even the roads to hospitals were bombed purposely to prevent the ambulances from taking people. One of my friends lost 23 members of his extended family, aged from 6 months to 9 years old. Even though the news cycle completely stopped focusing on us when the ceasefire was announced, we knew that very little had changed because Israel never abides by the terms of any ceasefire it has ever signed. but also because Gaza lives under the stranglehold of Israel, and at any moment Israel can strike it again. And they have historically always attacked Gaza every few weeks in between each of these major attacks, the last one being in 2014. And right now we're in a moment where I think 3 days ago it was, 3 or 4 days ago, the Israeli police announced that they would be arresting 1,500 people in the next 48 hours of the people who had participated in the uprising that has happened this month. And so we've seen mass arrests, and mostly young people. A lot of people aged between 13 and 17 from working class families have been the targets. And part of the reason for these arrests, and 1,500 of them were among Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, which is also quite historic. And this is because of their historic participation in this uprising. So over the last month, we have never seen an uprising since the last Intifada in the early 2000s, where every part of historic Palestine and the Palestinian diaspora participated at the same time. We saw, for example, Palestinians in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan leading marches of thousands of people strong against the borders, symbolically returning home. And some people were killed at those borders. We saw people in Gaza protesting. This was before the strikes began. We had on May 18th a historic general strike, which hasn't happened in the history, in our history since the 30s, since before the Zionist state was even created, where all parts of Palestine participated in the strike. And while everyone wasn't at work, instead everyone was going to the streets. I left my house, I saw immediately someone had put out strike flyers outside our doors. And I started walking, and every single person I saw on the street was walking towards the march. And it was the largest march I've ever seen in Ramallah. I think we were about 12,000, but this is a city of 200,000, it's very small. So it was quite an enormous presence. And then those thousands of people ended up walking to the point of confrontation with the Israeli state, where at the illegal settlement of Beit Il, where Israelis had kind of a green light to be using live ammunition on protesters. The day of the strike, we saw, so just to give you an idea of how the labor works, Israel often claims that it doesn't rely on Palestinian labor and that it would be better off if we all just left. But in reality, Palestinians, we make up 20% of the Israeli citizen population. We make up 50% of pharmacists, of construction workers. We make up over 20% of doctors and nurses in the Israeli sectors. So on the day of the strike, out of 65,000 construction workers, only 110 of them went to work. So 65,000 Palestinian construction workers who travel every day from the West Bank to Israel to go to work. Only 100 went to work. And to give you context, at the height of the COVID lockdown, 43,000 still went to work. So this was epic, and this cost the Israeli construction sector about $39 million in one day. Sanitation and transportation services were also super impacted. I don't have the numbers, but Palestinian workers also make up huge parts of those sectors. Here in Ramallah, the day after the general strike, the same streets that we had marched for protests, we marched 3 funeral processions, and including one of them was for a 17-year-old boy who'd been shot in the head from a close distance at one of the protests. I feel like I have so much to say, but I would just say that right now we're at the point where they're trying to, I think Israel has noticed that this month has really activated a young generation that has never felt the type of unity that we've seen. This uprising has actually been colloquially called the unity uprising. And I think for most of those people, they were too young during the last Intifada. The only thing that they know of it was is the repression that they felt the years after the Intifada. And so there really wasn't this sense of empowerment that we're seeing these days. And I think that this campaign of mass arrests that's targeting especially the young generation is intended to take away what might have been won in this month and to plant fear in people. And of course, like, there's many people fighting against it, but the trauma of being arrested when you're 13 years old is something that's very hard to fight. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there. I covered a lot. But
thank you so much, Rana, for this very heavy words to give an idea to my fellow Filipinos in there what Rana was talking about when people are for the first time doing a general strike and trying to really out the colonial settlers. It's the same way as how the historic people power revolution in the Philippines, where it started mobilizing with only students, university students, and then trying to garner more alliances with workers and then farmers, and then it just grew from there on, and then allied with religious sectors as well, and that's how they ended up outing dictator Marcos. We hope that we're fighting in the ground in solidarity, international solidarity. As you can see, we have a lot of youth who are now interested in what is happening. We want to do something. So solidarity, Rana, solidarity. I will take a little bit of just a down moment just to garner everything. So I will speak lighter today. I had my coffee, so I'm going to get a little bit more active, but it's okay. I will present our new speaker. So let me just put this thing here. So our next speaker will be Rendilyn Kuyop, is member of a Cordillera People's Alliances. Renz herself is an Igorot of Tiwali tribe of Ifugao province. She became more involved and active while pursuing her bachelor's degree. Renz, the floor is yours. Magandang gabi. Thank you so much for being with us today here. I know it's late there in the Philippines, but you made time for us, so thank you for that. Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Kumusta?
Hi. Kumusta? Hello, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to join in this activity. I would just like to thank my fellow speaker for sharing as well the concrete situation in Palestine. Now, the struggle of the Palestinian people for land and their rights is so much intertwined with the indigenous people's struggle for ancestral domain and for our struggle against national oppression. So, because isn't it the objective of imperialism is to consolidate power and concentrate, monopolize resources. So it's more than just a misunderstanding about political stance or principles. It's all about resources. And just like what is happening with in Palestine, of course, that is what is happening there is on a very massive or different scale. And we really we raise our voice and join the others in the reverberating condemnation of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinian people. Now, as for the reflection of imperialism, US imperialism, as well as the Chinese imperialist aggression on the Philippine territories, it is also mirrored in the situation of indigenous peoples here in the Cordilleras particularly. So we have, under the current regime of Duterte, the Duterte leadership, we have experienced and intensified state attacks. So at present, when at the time when we are we are reeling with the effects of the pandemic, or everyone is actually confronted with all the compounding economic, social impacts of the pandemic, we also have this other issue, or the other aspect of the struggle that we have to face with. So since last year, there has been an intensification of the state attacks against progressive organizations, farmers organizations, youth activists, indigenous peoples, from people from all walks of life who are criticizing or raising their voices against the oppression and tyranny of the government. So most of these are directed against the people, the dissenters, or those who are condemning all these attacks against the people. So as an organization, as a progressive organization that has for many decades, for many years, has been very active and vocal in calling out the government about their negligence and failures, and of course their sorry, it's my cat. Excuse me. So we also have been subjected to all these attacks. For example, our leaders as well as our members, if in Palestine the people are being, the Palestinians are being robbed of their homes, their lands, the indigenous peoples of the Cordilleras as well are facing the same dilemma, but in the form of development aggression, wherein this neoliberal policies on development are taking away or disenfranchising the indigenous peoples by pushing in or pushing for large-scale mining operations in the ancestral domain of indigenous peoples, building destructive or environmentally detrimental energy projects without the consent or the agreement of indigenous peoples. And we also have government structures who are making these things easier to happen by siding with the corporate factor instead of staying true to their mandate to give voice to the people. So as an organization that's been active in opposing those forms of oppression and disenfranchisement of indigenous peoples, we are subjected to the attacks that is meant to silence or suppress the Cordillera peoples mass movement. And so most of our activities are labeled or declared as terrorist activities. Our leaders are tagged as terrorists. Some of them are charged with fabricated charges. Our current chairperson, Mr. Wendell Bulingat, is currently facing a trumped-up murder charge. And some of our officers as well are charged with cyber libel cases because they're actively coming out or reporting on the status on the ground, wherein most of our members are being forced to sign documents renouncing their membership with our organization. And of course, when you are faced with a squad of armed men and you're intimidated, there's no other way but to you always have to consider your safety, because dead men tell no tales. So with this situation, the government is also using or laying out the legal framework to weaponize the pandemic, as well as our legislation to suppress the people's movements. So last year, we have the anti-terrorism law in place, although they still have to, it still has to go through the culmination of the internal rules and regulation, or the implementation. It is actually being implemented in different forms. For example, there has been a series of raids in offices and homes of activists, peasant leaders, progressive organizations members, and even youth leaders. So they are conducting raids in offices, planting evidences like explosives, guns, just to implicate them as terrorists or illegal possession of those firearms or explosives. And for that, for these fabricated evidences, they are being jailed. So there has been a considerable spike in the number of illegally detained or arbitrarily arrested activists and dissenters. So the anti-terrorism law, we call it the terror law, since the broad and vague definition of terrorism in this particular legislation makes or puts everyone in danger, and the definition of terrorism and the terrorist activities, it doesn't have a very clear It's not stated clearly in the law, and that is put into the subjective view of the anti-terrorism council. And the council is formed by military men or the retired military generals. So the interests of this particular factor or group. So through these laws, repressive laws, they're trying to justify the state attacks against the people. So for now, since as an organization, aside from the Trump charges and the legal arrest and detention, we also have the National Police, the Philippine National Police, also on a very aggressive campaign to declare our organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance, and all its members and leadership, and even the member organizations under this umbrella, they're on a very aggressive campaign to declare it as persona non grata in most of the provinces and communities in the Cordillera, meaning to be declared PNG or persona non grata is to be unwanted in a particular place, and that robs you of civil and political benefits, since if you're unwanted, you can be denied of particular services that you're entitled to as a person, as a citizen of as a constituent of the particular place. And so for this is one of our active campaigns as of present, is to combat the misinformation and disinformation about our organization, because we have been continually linked with the Communist Party of the Philippines, saying that we are a front organization, because as you know, the Communist Party of the Philippines and its armed and political wing is declared as a terrorist organization in the country. So therefore, being linked to it, despite the lack of evidence or factual basis, is still dangerous to the people being subjected to it. We call that red tagging or red baiting. So we have we also have that that's another form of state attack, rampant red tagging, red baiting of people, basically anyone who speaks up against the regime's oppressive laws and the tyranny. So being one of the members of an organization that is subject to this intense repression, political repression, vilification by the state, takes a toll on the kind of work that we do with the communities, since because of the pandemic, there has been a lot of challenges. We have a hard time with connecting with the people on the ground to find out about their situation. And so there are still unreported cases of harassment, forced surrender as rebels or communist rebels, things like that. But of course, we are not taking this sitting down. So aside from continuing with the humanitarian work of the CPA, like the pandemic response, providing economic relief to some of the families who are experiencing the hard economic impact of the pandemic. Aside from those humanitarian efforts, we still continue with the campaign. Of course, we have to face some of the legal battles when it comes to the cases and these petitions, the spread of disinformation about our organization, and really character assassination of our leaders. So in some of, I have here a presentation, but I'm not sure if I can share my screen. But just for one, so we, most of our time are taken by the legal battles with involving courts, of course, and our lawyers to deal with the cases that we are facing, like several level cases and the Trump charges against our leaders. And there. So my presentation is really short. So if as in closing, I think I agree with what Rana mentioned earlier about as long as the imperialist machinery is in place, there won't be any freedom or justice for the oppressed people, indigenous, whether those are indigenous peoples or wherever in the world, as long as they're reached by the clause of imperialism. And for us, particularly in the Cordillera, for as long as the government sees our ancestral domain as a resource base and not as how we see it as indigenous peoples, like it's the home of it's the place where people live, people with a distinct culture and rights to life. For as long as they see our ancestral domain as a source of raw materials to serve the interest of transnational allies, then the kind of oppression and our struggle for self-determination and in defense of our ancestral land will never end. And it also now becomes a challenge in how to link up our arms with other organizations around the world who are facing the same situation perpetrated by the same enemy. So yes, we're very glad to be able to join in these activities, to learn from others, from other people, from other countries about their experiences and how we can be able to amplify their voices as well as join in their struggle as well. So I think that's it from me for tonight. And thank you so much for having me here. Down with US imperialism and long live international solidarity.
Yeah, just letting you know, Renz, that he didn't really share anything. If you would like us to see it, just briefly, feel free to do it at the moment. If not, we can move on. It's up to you.
That's fine.
It's fine. I mean,
yeah.
You can send it to us, and we can send it to people who attended our events as well.
All right, sure.
Cool.
No
okay, so let me just reshare my things. Thank you, Renz, for speaking up for us today. I know it's like 10 p.m. there now, 12-hour difference, Filipino time, what up? Thank you so much for taking your time, voicing your situation, the indigenous people in the Philippines. It's very important, especially the diaspora in Canada.
Yes.
Oops. Let me just, my tech, can you please? Good. Okay. Sorry. Oops. Yeah, just, it's very important because especially the diaspora outside the Philippines, especially here in Montreal, more and more people, Canada is known to have a bad relationship with indigenous people, and more Filipino in the diaspora is wondering okay, so what are you talking about? What is the indigenous people thing in the Philippines you're talking about? So it's a very nice perspective to know for the diaspora outside here. Let me just share my screen. That's what I was doing. And yes, we're moving on to a question and answer segment. So I'll give people a little bit of time to just your sentences in their mind for a bit while we take a little bit of break. So feel free to unmute yourself or write your question in the chats, and I will remain silent now.
Thank you. I was also going to say, Renz, I know you had an event coming up that you were hoping that we would talk about a bit. Did you want to address that quickly about the CPA's anniversary? And I can share the link to it.
Thank you for mentioning it. So actually, we're preparing for the 37th founding anniversary of the Cordillera People's Alliance. This is to recall the reason why the alliance was founded in the first place and how it came about, which is from the historic victory of the indigenous peoples in defense of ancestral land, wherein they were able to stop a mega dam project of the Marcos dictatorship back in the 70s and the 80s, which was funded by the World Bank. So that was a very huge victory for the Cordillera mass movement. From that experience, there was a reverberating call to set up an alliance wherein all indigenous peoples with the same perspective and the same purpose would come together and in an organization to be able to push for these common goals and advocacy. And that's how the CPA came about. So in celebration of the founding, that will be we're holding a virtual photo exhibit on our page, as well as a Zoom forum on the 4th of June. So the exhibit will start from the 31st until the 4th, as well on the same day of the online forum, and we're hoping you could join us. We're going to be highlighting or featuring some of the archived photos about the earliest activities and congresses that were held since the 80s. So it might be a good trip down memory lane. We're hoping you can join us as well.
I hope we put the link in the chat as well. So for those who are interested, definitely would want to know more about the perspectives. Voila. So as I mentioned, this is a question and answer. So if anyone in our audience wanted to have specific questions to our speakers or in general, the floor is yours. I also have some of my questions lined up. Oh yeah, there you go. We have one from Mathilde. Rana, how can we, oopsie, I can see it, sorry. How can we counter Israel's propaganda machine? What has been successful?
Yeah, very powerful machine. I think what I've been saying over and over again this month is that the only thing that makes it easier to speak about Palestine is if more people speak about Palestine. I mean, I saw over the last month so many statements come out, and then, you know, employers or, I mean, the Israeli lobby will target certain people on those lists of people who signed for Palestine and try and get them fired, try and say that they were anti-Semitic, or, I mean, this has been really the biggest counter to Palestine advocacy over the last month has been claims that every time someone criticizes Israel that they're anti-Semitic. And I think that the Israeli lobby in countries like Canada has been really building off of the social capital built by the anti-racist movement. So people are afraid when they hear, oh, I could be anti-Semitic, I don't want to be called anti-Semitic. And I think that we have to be really bold when we confront these accusations, because I've noticed people are afraid to talk about it. People are afraid to be called anti-Semitic. Well, don't do anything anti-Semitic. Like, talk about Palestine. There's nothing, I mean, it's actually kind of wild that we live under a Jewish supremacist state and people are afraid of being called anti-Semitic for speaking up for Palestinian rights. But I think that the more that people are kind of bold in their responses, and the more that people stand together, for example, like on US campuses, we saw, I mean, about 10 years ago when a professor would be targeted by the Israel lobby to be fired or to whatever, to face repercussions for speaking up for Palestine, usually Palestinian professors, I think that a lot of the time they felt isolated, that the Palestine movement wasn't ready to respond to those attacks, the solidarity movement. And I do think that that's changing. I think that we're also organizing ourselves across movements to be more prepared for these attacks. I mean, every Israeli propaganda response to criticism is always a red herring. They always will point to something else. So every time that you say, well, you know, you just killed children, like, what could you possibly respond? And they'll come to you with something that has absolutely nothing to do with the criticism. And I think that it's actually a very simple propaganda machine. I mean, I look at it and I sometimes have trouble responding because I just think it's so ridiculous. But I don't know. I guess my only answer is that I think we are becoming more bold, and I think that Palestinians too, across, because I think social media has played a big role in this because of its casual nature. A lot of Palestinians on social media have kind of stopped playing this diplomatic game of responding with the language that we think that our colonizers want us to use. And by our, I mean like Europe and the Americas. And I think people are speaking more boldly about what they actually feel and are experiencing. And I think that's been really successful. Also, obviously, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is a very powerful physical tool for us to push forward these kind of ideological concepts.
To reinvigorate you, Rana, when we went to the protests at the consulate here in Montreal, I have come across with some of my former classmates from college and university, and they are now proud to say that they're Palestinian. I never knew they were Palestinian. You know, I played volleyball with them. They were saying like, now is the time. This propaganda is like, everyone knows what's up now. And they were saying how they're proud to say that they're Palestinian, even though their parents are saying, like, don't say that because you're putting target behind your back. Putting in a parallel to a lot of Filipinos, they're still not proud to say that they're Filipino, but they say Pinoy are proud to be Pinoy, right? We are going back to this type of, we call it bayanihan. So like coming back to your ancestry, like to your heritage. So this is, you just need to be bold and just need to be unapologetic, right? So that's essentially it. Like, we're Palestinian, we're Filipino. This is it. There's no question in it. So my question would be, and this is goes to both ways. First for Renz, there has already been, I was born in the Philippines, and there was already a lot of talks about how the government has already been proposing to remedy the conflict. I know that in the Palestinian side, I don't like it calling it conflict, but I grew up calling it conflict. But in the Philippine side, the government, the Philippine government has already saying that, like, you know, we're trying to remedy whatever is your claims, the Igorot people, like, you know, you're always demanding for things. What do you say for those proposals that's been like ongoing?
When it comes to the conflict or the national oppression that we as indigenous peoples experience, from all the switching or changing leadership under the leadership, there has been no change since, well, they come up with those statements, but it's them who sabotages all efforts, whether from themselves or from our side, about settling with the conflicts. First, settling the conflict would mean listening to what the people are saying, or listening to how they want to determine the progress that works for them, and understanding their culture. It's not about forcing what you want down their throat just because you hold a political power. And so when we are met with this kind of force, of course, as people who feel like our lives are threatened, our culture is being eradicated, then we would respond with the same force. Otherwise, it's a loss for us. So by settling the conflict, what they meant is to keep us silent and docile and just be obedient to whatever they want. And of course, that wouldn't work, because what they want is to take out all the resources from our lands, disenfranchise us, while, for example, with the mining operations. So after the resources or the gold and all the mineral resources have been taken out, we are left with the carved mountains, the flattened mountains, and that's not how it's like we have lost, as indigenous peoples, we lost the material basis of our culture, our existence as a cultural, as indigenous peoples. And so we are trying, CPA particularly has been participating in lobbies, in dialogues with different government offices and mechanisms. But all of these efforts are sometimes met with, it's either by twisting it as, or marking it as communist propaganda, those kinds of things. And so we end up being charged with terrorist or false charges, and that's the direction of settling the conflict that the government is referring to.
Going back to the same question that I have, but for Rana, it's the same thing. If you look at Instagram, people are like, yeah, but Israel already has proposed something, but Palestinian didn't like it. What would you say for that one?
Israel has never proposed or given any concessions to its ultimate plan of taking over the entire historic Palestine and cleansing it of Palestinians. Even, I mean, I don't like to even get into this, but even Hamas and Fatah and all the political parties had accepted a two-state solution decades ago, and Israel wasn't ready to go there. But I think what we hear more often is what we hear from, the idea of the U.S. peace plan. We've been hearing about U.S. so-called peace negotiations. I mean, since Oslo, and Oslo being in the 90s, the agreement that Bill Clinton was part of, that put into place the Palestinian Authority, which I talked about briefly, as having security coordination with Israel and really developing a more sophisticated way of controlling Palestinians, where we police ourselves really before we're policed by the Israeli military occupation and the settler state. I think that every concession that Israel has made, including the ceasefire that just happened, that ceasefire only happened because of the people's movements. I mean, people here didn't stop celebrating for 3 days, didn't stop honking, literally couldn't sleep, because it was a people's win. Israel never stops unless it is forced to, because it is very clear about its goals in this land. And I think that people don't like to use words like genocide because they seem like dramatic, but I don't see any other word for when entire families are wiped from the map. I keep thinking about my friend because the only person that survived from that 23 people of the same family who were killed was one, I think he's 11 or 12-year-old. Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I think that most of those claims are disingenuous, but also I hate it when we talk about like what we're struggling with and then someone will end up being like, okay, so what's the solution? Don't you have a solution for us? And it's like, if you dare to even speak about an injustice, you have to have a sophisticated solution. And I think that also is really unfair because we can't even begin to think about what the solution is until we start to dismantle these conditions that make it impossible to even imagine a future.
Thank you. We got a few more minutes. I can ask for one more question if anyone has, or if not, I have one last question as like a finishing up. So I will. Also, we're going to have a photo up, just so that, oh yeah, I should have put this. This is just some contact info for our guest speakers as well. This is their Instagram account, as well as to Rana, who's also like reporting on the ground from her Instagram account. But we're going to have a hashtag coming up soon. So just letting everyone know so that you can prepare it, so you can write it down somewhere and we'll take a picture. If you're not comfortable, of course, you don't need to do it, right? I guess for one last question, since we're Anakbayan and we're a youth-led movement, what would be, for both speakers, what would be your message to the youth? Why do they have to care about this? I live in Canada. I'm perfectly comfortable here, right? Rana, you're already unmuted. You can start.
Me?
Yes.
Oh. I don't know. I think what I learned over the last month is that it's really impossible to force anyone to care in the areas where, like Jordan, for example, where Palestinians were given Jordanian citizenship and supposedly assimilated, and there has been almost no movement coming from Palestinians in Jordan, and there's like the stereotype that they're not active and so on. And then we saw tens of thousands of them raid the border in protest. And I thought it really went to show that like people are not apathetic or not caring. People are made cynical by these conditions, and they're made to not be able to imagine or to hope or to have any of the like emotional feelings that you need to be able to resist. And I think that understanding that, like, we also can know what we need to give youth to be able to empower them to take action over their futures and their current conditions. And I think that a lot of that is things like being able to imagine and being able to hope and to see, like, this moment activated youth, and it's because they for one moment felt this, you know, hope and optimism and unity. And I think it's our role to keep fostering that in them.
Thank you. Renz, any parting words?
Okay. Actually, I'm an Anakbayan alumni from the local chapter here. And well, from the orientation of Anakbayan, it would be impossible to turn a blind eye to these kinds of things. But yes, I understand for some people, of course, it's not wrong or it's not impossible to feel fear. Actually, it's abnormal if you don't feel fear, but what's important is that you don't get paralyzed by fear and you get through that. So we always say, or with this kind of situation, with the conditions, the kind of conditions in place, it is impossible really to imagine about a future. That means we have nothing to lose, and we have nothing to gain if we just we have nothing to gain as well if we don't make a move, since all these things will just be compounded and continue on with the future. So if we want to build something that would mean that works for us, then we have to get involved or participate in the movement to make it happen.
That's right. That's right. All right. So we're wrapping it up. We're right on time for this one. Power to the people, and we have to take ownership of our own future. We're the youths. We grew up hearing our parents be like, "You're the future." Now the future is present now. So I thank again our speakers for coming in with their time. I know you two are very busy. Rana, we're always thinking of you. Renz, we're always fighting for the liberation of our people. I have my thingy here already prepared. So for those who are prepared, for those who are not comfortable, it's fine. Wait, I will unshare this. Oh no, that's not it. Stop. Des, are you okay to do screen cap?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So where is it? Yeah. So we'll do a screenshot, please. And Des, you can just roll call whatever how you want it to be.
Okay.
Yay.
On 3, 1, 2, 3. You guys are so pretty. Thank you.
Yes, so we'll do isang bagsak. Isa means one, bagsak, one down. Just coming into that people powers revolution movement during Marcos era, the dictatorship. Andy, you're doing that. No, I'm just doing like a little bit of description. During the Marcos dictatorship, a lot of activists flee the country because, of course, we're being persecuted, and they're trying to connect with other people who doesn't speak who doesn't speak English or Tagalog, right? So farmers, Filipino farmers working with Mexicans who kind of understand each other because we kind of understand Spanish, but still kind of having hard time. So every day after this shift, they will go isang bagsak because one down to go, and the next day we see each other and start working again. So that's just it. Long live international solidarity. We will always fight for true liberation of indigenous people. Isang bagsak. Again, thank you so much for Rana. Thank you so much for Renz for coming in, and I will liberate you all and liberate everyone else in the future.